McPherson County, Dakota Territory, April 1893. While every homesteader in the territory was building separate cabins on separate claims, 4 immigrant families were doing something that made the Americans ride over just to call them fools. The Polish carpenter had convinced 3 other families to build their cabins sharing walls in a square, 4 homes connected like a fortress around an empty courtyard. The foreigners are building a poorhouse, 4 families crammed together like city rats. Nobody understood what Alexander knew about shared walls and rotating fires that would keep 4 families warm, while their neighbors burned their wood piles to ash alone. Subscribe and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Alexander Nowak had spent 26 years learning how buildings could share more than walls. Born in a village outside Krakow in southern Poland, he grew up in a region where connected dwellings were not poverty, but wisdom. Polish villages had built row houses for centuries, families sharing walls not because they could not afford separate homes, but because shared walls meant shared warmth. Heat that passed through a common wall did not escape into the winter sky. It passed to a neighbor who would pass heat back. The wall between became a bridge, not a barrier. His father had been a carpenter in a village where no home stood alone. Every dwelling connected to the next, forming continuous rows that faced winter as a single unit rather than isolated boxes fighting the cold separately. A family whose fire burned strong warmed not only their own walls, but the walls of families on either side. When their fire died, their neighbors' fires warmed them in return. The village survived together or suffered together. No family froze alone while neighbors hoarded warmth behind separate walls. The mathematics were simple. A cabin standing alone had 4 walls exposed to winter, 4 surfaces bleeding heat into frozen air, but a cabin sharing 1 wall with a neighbor had only 3 exposed walls. Share 2 walls with 2 neighbors, and only 2 walls faced the cold. 4 cabins arranged in a square, each sharing 2 walls with adjacent families, cut total exposed surface nearly in half. The same interior space, the same families, but half the walls fighting winter instead of all of them. Alexander arrived in Dakota Territory in the spring of 1891, following railroad work that brought Polish laborers to the American frontier. When the railroad jobs ended, he filed a claim for 160 acres in McPherson County and sent for his wife Marta and their 3 children. The land was flat, treeless, and brutal, nothing like the sheltered valleys of southern Poland. He built his first cabin that summer using techniques Americans showed him. A separate structure standing alone on his claim. 4 walls facing the prairie wind. A stone fireplace on the north wall. Good construction by local standards. His nearest neighbor, a Swedish family named Lindqvist, built an identical cabin a quarter-mile east. 2 German families, the Brenners and the Millers, built similar structures nearby. 4 families, 4 separate cabins. 4 isolated boxes preparing to fight winter alone. His first Dakota winter taught him the cost of American isolation. The wind found every wall. Heat fled through surfaces that faced nothing but frozen emptiness. His fireplace consumed wood at rates that terrified him. A cord every 6 days, flames roaring while cold pressed through walls that had no neighbors to share warmth with. Marta stuffed rags along baseboards where cold crept in from every direction. The children slept in coats. The woodpile shrank while January stretched endlessly ahead. He walked to check on the Lindqvist family after a brutal cold snap and found them in identical misery. Eric Lindqvist, burning through his woodpile at the same terrifying rate. His wife Bridget layering blankets on children who shivered despite flames dancing in the hearth. In Poland, we would share a wall, Alexander said, standing in Lindqvist's cabin, watching heat flee through 4 exposed surfaces. Your fire would warm my family. My fire would warm yours. The wall between would carry heat, not lose it. In Sweden also, Lindqvist replied, feeding logs to a fire that could never satisfy the cold pressing from every direction. Villages where no home stood alone. But here the Americans say each family must have their own land, their own cabin. They build apart and freeze apart. By spring, Alexander had made his decision. He would not build alone again. He would find families willing to build together, 4 cabins sharing walls in a square, each family sacrificing isolation for survival. The Americans would call it foolish. He would call it wisdom that European villages had practiced for centuries. The argument came on a warm May evening in 1893, when Alexander gathered the 3 other families at his cabin to show them the plans he had drawn on brown paper. 4 cabins, 4 families, but not 4 separate buildings. He spread the sketches across his rough wooden table, showing a square arrangement with a hollow center. Each cabin shares 2 walls with neighbors. The Lindqvists here, sharing a wall with us and with the Brenners. The Muellers here, sharing with the Brenners and back to us. A square. 4 homes. Only 8 exterior walls instead of 16. Eric Lindqvist studied the drawing, his weathered face showing cautious interest. In Sweden, we call this a fyrkant, a 4 square. Farms built this way for generations. But here, the Americans say each family needs their own cabin on their own land. Klaus Brenner interrupted, his blacksmith's hands flat on the table. They will say we are building a tenement, a poorhouse, that we cannot afford proper homes. Let them say what they wish. Alexander traced the shared walls with his finger. Last winter, you burned how much wood, Klaus? 7 cords, nearly 8. And you, Eric? 6.5. Would have been more if the children hadn't slept in our bed for warmth. And Heinrich? Heinrich Müller shook his head grimly. I lost count. We burned furniture in February, a chair my wife's mother gave us. Alexander let the silence hold before speaking. 4 families, perhaps 28 cords between us. 28 cords to heat 16 walls that each stood alone fighting winter. He tapped the drawing. This design has 8 exterior walls, half the surface bleeding heat into the sky. But more than that, we share fire duty. He pointed to the 4 cabins in sequence. Each family maintains fire for 3 hours while others sleep. The Lindqvists from evening until 9. The Brenners from 9 until midnight. We take midnight until 3. The Müllers carry us to dawn. 1 fire every 3 hours keeps all 4 cabins warm through shared walls. Alone, we each burn all night. Together, we each burn 3 hours. Marta Nowak stood beside her husband, her expression showing the calculation. 1/4 the night fires, by 1/4 the wood through darkness. Perhaps 12 cords total for all 4 families, instead of 28. Alexander looked at each man in turn. We build on my claim. I have filed. The cabins connect on my land, but each family keeps their own space, their own door, their own hearth. We share walls and fire duty, nothing else. Word reached the settlement within 2 weeks. Samuel Thornton, an American homesteader who had ranched in McPherson County for 11 years, rode over in late May to see if the rumors were true. He found 4 families digging foundation trenches for what appeared to be a single large structure, rather than 4 separate cabins. "No whack," Thornton called from his horse. "Folks in town are saying you're building some kind of immigrant barracks. 4 families crammed together sharing walls like you can't afford your own homes." Alexander set down his shovel. 4 cabins. 4 families. Shared walls. In Poland, in Sweden, in Germany, villages build this way for centuries. Shared walls mean shared warmth. This isn't Europe. In America, a man builds his own home on his own land. What you're building looks like a fort. Or a prison. Thornton shook his head. 4 families sharing walls, sharing fires. What happens when one family doesn't do their share? When someone's fire goes cold and everyone suffers? Then we wake them and they build their fire. We are neighbors. We will watch for each other. Neighbors live next door, not through the same wall. Thornton turned his horse. Your choice, but you're building a mistake. Come December, you'll wish you each had your own cabin you could heat your own way. Marta watched Thornton ride away. She turned to her husband, her expression caught between hope and doubt. He thinks we will fight each other before winter ends. He fights winter alone and calls it pride. Alexander picked up his shovel. We will fight winter together and call it wisdom. December will teach him which approach keeps children warm. What Alexander Nowak understood from 26 years of Polish village construction, modern building scientists would later quantify with precision. But the principles he was applying had been tested through centuries of European connected dwelling design in climates that demanded efficiency over pride. The fundamental insight was that heat escapes through exterior surfaces, not interior ones. A cabin standing alone had 4 walls, a roof, and a floor, 6 surfaces losing heat to the frozen world. But a wall shared between 2 heated spaces lost nothing. Heat that passed through a shared wall simply moved from one family's cabin to the neighbor's cabin. It never escaped. It never vanished into the sky. It stayed within the connected structure, warming whoever needed it most at that moment. The mathematics worked decisively in favor of connected construction. A single cabin measuring 20 feet by 20 feet had 80 linear feet of exterior wall surface. 4 separate cabins had 320 linear feet of walls facing winter. 320 feet of surface bleeding heat into frozen air. But 4 cabins arranged in a square, each sharing 2 walls with neighbors, had only 160 feet of exterior surface. Half the walls. Half the heat loss. The same families in the same amount of space, but half the surface fighting the cold. The shared walls did more than simply not lose heat. They actively transferred warmth between units. Heat flows from warmer spaces to cooler spaces through any material. When the Nowak family's fire burned strong, and their cabin might reach 60 degrees while the adjacent Lindqvist cabin, whose fire had burned down, held only 50 degrees. Heat would flow through the shared wall from Nowak to Lindqvist, warming the cooler space without any fire burning there. The wall became a conduit, not a barrier. The Lindqvists received warmth they had not created. The Nowaks lost warmth they could spare. The system balanced itself continuously. This thermal bridging made the rotating fire schedule possible. 4 families alone would each need fires burning through the entire night. 4 fires consuming wood for 8 to 10 hours of darkness. But 4 connected families could rotate duty. When the Lindqvists' fire burned from evening until 9 o'clock, their heat passed through shared walls to the Brenners on one side and the Millers on the other. Or when the Brenners took over from 9 until midnight, their heat supported the Lindqvists, whose fire now rested, and the Nowaks on their opposite wall. Each family burned for only 3 hours while receiving warmth from neighbors' fires for the remaining 9 hours of night. The courtyard design added another advantage. Wind protection. Wind drove heat loss through 2 mechanisms. It increased the temperature differential at wall surfaces, and it forced cold air through gaps and cracks via pressure differentials. A cabin standing alone faced wind from every direction. But 4 cabins arranged in a square created a protected courtyard at the center. Wind striking the structure hit exterior walls but could not reach the courtyard. Each cabin had one wall facing inward to the protected space, a wall that never felt wind chill. So never faced pressure differentials, never lost heat to moving air. The design also provided redundancy that isolated cabins lacked. If a lone cabin's fire died at midnight during a cold snap, the family faced freezing temperatures with no backup. But if one family's fire died in the connected structure, heat continued flowing from neighbors' fires through shared walls. The failing family might grow uncomfortable, but they would not freeze. Their neighbors' warmth bought time to wake, rebuild the fire, and recover. No single failure could doom a family when 3 other families' heat surrounded them. Alexander's neighbors saw connected cabins as poverty, families too poor to build separately. So Alexander saw connected cabins as insurance. Families too wise to fight winter alone when fighting together cost half the wood and provided twice the safety. Construction began in early June 1893, as soon as the ground thawed enough to set foundation logs properly. The 4 families worked together from the first day. Alexander laid out the footprint, a square measuring 48 feet on each side with a central courtyard 16 feet across. Each cabin would measure 16 feet deep by 24 feet wide, sharing its 2 interior walls with adjacent neighbors. The exterior walls faced outward to the prairie. The interior walls faced the protected courtyard. Every family would have their own entrance opening onto the shared central space. They started with the foundation, heavy cottonwood logs squared on 2 sides, laid in the massive square pattern with interior divisions marking each cabin's boundaries. The shared wall foundations required the most care. These logs would support walls belonging to 2 families simultaneously. Alexander insisted on the heaviest timbers for these critical joints, knowing that shared walls must never shift or separate. The exterior walls rose first. Each family took responsibility for their own outward-facing walls, the Nowaks building the south face, the Lindqvists the east, the Brenners the north, the Millers the west. They used standard log construction, horizontal courses notched at corners and chinked with clay and moss. But they built to identical heights and specifications so the walls would meet properly where cabins joined. The shared interior walls required collaboration. Alexander and Eric Lindqvist built their common wall together, each working from his own side, fitting logs that would belong to both families equally. So they chinked both faces, Alexander's side and Eric's side, creating a wall that would transfer heat between cabins while blocking sound and maintaining privacy. The wall was property of neither family and both families. It existed to serve the connection, not the division. Klaus Brenner and Heinrich Miller built their shared wall simultaneously. Then the Lindqvist-Brenner wall rose, and finally the Müller-Nowak wall that completed the square. 8 shared wall sections in total, each built by the 2 families it would serve, each chinked on both sides, each designed to conduct warmth rather than block it. The courtyard took shape as the walls rose, a protected square of earth 16 feet across, surrounded on all sides by cabin walls, open to the sky but sheltered from wind by the structure itself. They paved it with flat stones hauled from a creek bed 3 miles distant, creating a surface that would not turn to mud in rain or snow. Each cabin received its own fireplace on its exterior wall. The Nowak's hearth on the south face, the Lindqvists on the east, the Brenners on the north, the Millers on the west. 4 chimneys rose from 4 corners of the structure, each serving one family's primary heat source. But the shared walls meant that every fire warmed more than one cabin. The roofs they built as 4 separate sections meeting at the courtyard center sloped inward so rain and snowmelt would drain into the protected space rather than running down exterior walls. Heavy sod insulation topped each roof, 12 inches of earth that would hold heat inside. Marta Nowak entered the completed structure on the first evening of September. She walked through her own cabin, then through the door to the courtyard, then into the Lindqvist cabin where Bridget was arranging furniture. "I can feel your cook fire," Marta said, pressing her palm against the shared wall. "The warmth comes through." Bridget pressed her hand to the same wall from her side. "And I feel yours. The wall is like a living thing. It breathes heat between us." Alexander stood in the courtyard, looking at the 4 doors opening onto the protected space, the 4 chimneys rising from 4 corners, the 4 families preparing for winter as one unit rather than 4. In Poland, we call this a wspólnota, a commonwealth. 4 families, 4 homes, one fight against winter. He looked up at the evening sky framed by cabin walls on every side. The Americans will see 4 families too poor to build separately. We will see 4 families too wise to freeze alone. By late September, the connected cabin structure had become the most discussed construction in McPherson County. The summer curiosity had shifted into something closer to genuine ridicule, as neighbors realized the 4 immigrant families were actually planning to live sharing walls like tenement dwellers in some crowded European city. "It's unnatural," one rancher's wife declared at the general store in Leola. 4 families crammed together like they can't afford separate homes. Those poor women sharing walls with strangers, hearing every argument, every crying baby. The foreigners have built themselves a poorhouse and called it clever. The technical objections multiplied as temperatures dropped. Samuel Thornton rode over in early October with new concerns, his breath steaming in the cold morning air. "Nowak, I've been thinking about your arrangement," he said, sitting his horse at the edge of the courtyard. "What happens when one family's fire gets out of control? Shared walls mean shared disaster. One chimney fire and all 4 families burn together. You've built a tinderbox." Alexander had anticipated this. 4 families means 8 adult eyes watching for danger instead of 2. We check each other's chimneys. We watch each other's fires. A lone cabin burns with no one to see until too late. Our structure has neighbors on every side who smell smoke before flames spread. And the arguments? 4 families sharing walls, sharing fire duty. Someone will slack. Someone will burn green wood that smokes but gives no heat. Someone's children will keep the others awake. By January, you'll be at each other's throats. By January, we will be warm while you burn through your woodpile alone. Arguments we can solve, freezing we cannot. The first real test came on October 24th. A cold snap dropped temperatures to 12 degrees. Not extreme, but enough to test the connected structure. The 4 families implemented their rotating fire schedule for the first time. The Lindqvists built their evening fire at 6 o'clock, feeding it steadily until 9. Then they banked the coals and the Brenners took over, their fire roaring until midnight. Alexander woke at midnight to take the Nowak shift. He found his cabin holding 48 degrees, despite no fire burning since the previous evening. Heat from the Lindqvist and Brenner fires had passed through shared walls all night, yours keeping his family comfortable without a single log consumed. He built his fire and maintained it until 3 in the morning, knowing his flames now warmed not only his own family, but passed heat to the Lindqvists on one side and the Millers on the other. At 3, Heinrich Miller took over, his fire carrying all 4 families through until dawn. Marta noticed it first while preparing breakfast. "We burned for 3 hours. Only 3 hours through the entire night, and the cabin never dropped below 45 degrees. The Lindqvists' heat came through our east wall. The Mullers' heat came through our west wall. We received warmth for 9 hours while giving warmth for 3. Alexander pressed his palm against the shared wall with the Lindqvists, warm to the touch. "The wall works as I promised. It carries heat between us." By November, the difference had become impossible to ignore. The 4 families burned perhaps 2 cords total through October, a half cord per family. Samuel Thornton, heating his isolated cabin alone, had already burned nearly 2 cords himself. His walls faced wind from every direction. His fire served only his own family. His heat escaped through 4 exposed walls, while the immigrant families lost heat through only 8 walls shared among 4 households. "The neighbors say we live like animals in a barn," Brigid Lindqvist said one November evening, warming her hands near the shared wall that radiated heat from the Brenners' evening fire. "But animals in a barn survive winter by sharing warmth. Perhaps they understand something Americans have forgotten." Klaus Brenner's voice came muffled through the wall from the other side. "Let them say what they wish. Their pride keeps them cold and alone. Our shared walls keep us warm together." January 1894 arrived with a brutality that old-timers would reference for decades. An Arctic front descended from Canada on January 8th, driving temperatures from a manageable 8 degrees to -26 by midnight. Dawn on January 9th brought -32. By the morning of January 13th, the thermometer outside the general store in Leola read -44 degrees. The wind screamed across the Dakota Prairie at 30 miles per hour, finding every cabin that stood alone, every wall that faced the empty plains, every family that had built in isolation. The homesteads with separate cabins suffered first and worst. Samuel Thornton's farmhouse stood alone on his claim, 4 walls facing wind that never stopped. His fireplace consumed wood at rates that terrified him, a quarter cord per day just to maintain 32 degrees in the main room. His wife fed the fire every hour through the night, stumbling from bed in frozen darkness to keep flames alive. The corners of his cabin dropped to 15 degrees. Frost formed on interior walls. His children slept in coats and boots, huddled in one bed for shared body heat because the fire could not warm the entire space. By January 11th, Thornton had moved his family into the single room containing the fireplace, abandoning the rest of his cabin to the cold. They ate, slept, and lived within 10 feet of flames that roared constantly, yet could not push warmth to walls that bled heat in every direction. His woodpile, 7 cords carefully stacked in autumn, had shrunk to less than 3. The mathematics were terrifying. At this rate, he would run out of fuel before February with 2 months of winter remaining. Across McPherson County, the story repeated in every isolated cabin. The Anderson family burned their chicken coop for fuel when their woodpile ran low. The Petersons tore apart a wagon for firewood. A bachelor homesteader named Garrett was found frozen in his cabin on January 14th. His fire had died while he slept, and his 4 exposed walls had surrendered heat faster than his body could generate it. He died alone in a cabin that stood alone, with no neighbor's warmth to buy him time. Every isolated cabin bled heat through walls that faced nothing but frozen emptiness. Every family fought winter alone, burning wood at desperate rates while cold pressed through surfaces that had no backup, no support, no shared warmth from neighbors. Nobody thought about the immigrant compound during those first desperate days. They had their own survival to manage. At the connected structure on the Nowak claim, Alexander woke on the morning of January 13th, the coldest day of the cold snap, to find his cabin at 47 degrees. The Muller's fire had burned down hours earlier, but heat continued radiating through the shared wall from the Brenners, whose fire still glowed. The Lindqvists' cabin on his other side held 44 degrees, warmed by residual heat from both adjacent families. The rotating schedule continued without interruption. Each family burned for 3 hours. Each family received warmth for 9 hours. The shared walls carried heat continuously. Whoever's fire burned strongest gave warmth to whoever's fire burned weakest. And no cabin dropped below 40 degrees. No family burned alone through the entire night. Klaus Brenner checked the communal woodpile on January 14th. They had burned perhaps 1 cord total since the cold snap began. 1 cord among 4 families. Thornton, alone in his isolated cabin, had burned nearly 3 cords in the same period. "We are warm because we are together," Brenner told the other families gathered in the protected courtyard, bundled against cold that could not reach them through walls on every side. "Thornton is freezing because he is alone. His pride keeps him isolated. Our walls keep us connected." Heinrich Meller looked up at the strip of gray sky visible above the courtyard. "The Americans think we built a poorhouse. We built a fortress, and the enemy cannot breach walls that face inward instead of outward." Samuel Thornton reached the immigrant compound just after noon on January 15th. The walk had taken over 2 hours through snow that squeaked like crushed glass beneath his boots. His face was raw beneath 2 scarves wrapped tight. His fingers ached inside 3 pairs of mittens. He had worn every piece of clothing he owned and still felt the cold pressing through to his bones. He came because he had to know. Either the immigrant families were suffering worse than him, crowded together in their shared misery, or they knew something he did not. From a distance, he had noticed that only one chimney at a time seemed to pour serious smoke. The other three showed thin wisps or nothing at all. In his isolated cabin, his single chimney roared constantly and still could not keep his family warm. He found Alexander Nowak in the protected courtyard, carrying firewood from a communal pile that looked barely touched. Perhaps 4 cords remained stacked against the interior wall, yet winter was half over and 4 families had plenty of fuel to spare. Thornton's own pile, once 7 cords, had shrunk to less than 3 with 2 months of cold still ahead. "Nowak," Thornton called, his voice cracking from the cold. "I came to see how you're managing. 4 families in this cold. I thought you'd be struggling worse than us." Alexander gestured toward the nearest door. "Come inside. See what 4 families sharing walls provides." Thornton stepped through the door into the Nowak cabin and stopped as if he had walked into an invisible wall. Warmth surrounded him, not the blast of a roaring fire, but something steadier, something that pressed from multiple directions at once. He turned slowly, confused. A modest fire burned in the hearth, barely a quarter of what roared in his own fireplace, yet the cabin felt warmer than his home had felt in weeks. "What temperature do you hold in here?" Thornton asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Alexander pointed to a thermometer mounted near the door. 51 degrees this morning. It was 47 when I woke, before I lit the fire." 51 degrees. Thornton's cabin hadn't seen 50 degrees since November, and that was standing directly before a roaring fire. His corners held 15 degrees. His far walls felt like ice. "How is this possible? Your fire is nothing, barely enough to cook breakfast. Feel the wall." Alexander pressed his palm against the shared wall with the Lindqvists. "I feel what the wall provides." Thornton pressed his hand against the logs. Warm. Not hot, but warm, as if a fire burned on the other side. He moved to the opposite wall shared with the Mullers. Warm there, too. Both interior walls radiated heat into the Nowak cabin. The Lindqvists' fire burned until 9 last night. The Brenners burned until midnight. I burned until 3. The Mullers carried us to dawn. Alexander touched both shared walls in turn. Each fire warms 3 families through connected walls. I burn for 3 hours and receive warmth for 9 hours. My walls bring heat from neighbors while my fire rests. How much wood are you burning? All 4 families? Perhaps 1 cord per week. Total. Among all 4 families. Thornton calculated in stunned silence. 1 cord per week for 4 families. Or he was burning nearly a cord every 3 days for 1 family alone. 4 times the wood to achieve temperatures 20 degrees colder. My children sleep in coats. Thornton's voice broke. My wife feeds the fire every hour through the night. We've abandoned half our cabin to the cold, and your family sleep warm on a quarter of our wood. Alexander nodded slowly. Your cabin stands alone. 4 walls bleeding heat into empty prairie. Our cabins share walls. Heat that leaves my cabin enters the Lindqvists' cabin. Heat that leaves theirs enters the Brenners'. Nothing escapes until it reaches an exterior wall. And we have half the exterior walls you have. Thornton stood in the warm cabin, feeling heat radiate from walls on 2 sides, understanding for the first time what isolation had cost him. Show me everything. Show me how the shared walls work. Alexander walked Thornton through every detail. They started in the Nowak cabin, then passed through the courtyard into the Lindqvist cabin, where Eric was banking his morning fire. Feel the wall from this side, Alexander said, pointing to the shared wall with the Nowaks. Thornton pressed his palm against the logs. Warm, the same warmth he had felt from the Nowak side. conducted through the shared timber. The wall carries heat in both directions. When my fire burns strong and Eric's burns low, my heat flows to him. When his fire burns strong and mine rests, his heat flows to me. Alexander traced the shared wall with his hand. The heat never escapes. It moves between families until someone needs it. They walked through all 4 cabins in sequence, Nowak to Lindqvist, to Brenner to Miller, and back to Nowak. To each shared wall radiated warmth. Each cabin held temperatures between 48 and 53 degrees. Each family had burned for only 3 hours the previous night, yet remained comfortable through the entire darkness. "The courtyard," Thornton said, standing in the protected central space. "No wind reaches here. 4 walls surround it. Wind strikes the exterior and cannot penetrate to the center. Each cabin has 1 wall facing this protected space. A wall that never feels wind, never loses heat to moving air." Alexander gestured at the 4 doors opening onto the courtyard. "We pass between cabins without stepping into the storm. The children play here on mild days, sheltered from wind that would freeze them on open prairie." Samuel Thornton did not keep what he learned to himself. By January 20th, he had described the immigrant compound to every homesteader he encountered at the emergency supply distribution in Leola. Most didn't believe him. A rancher named Crawford laughed outright. "You're telling me 4 families crammed together stay warmer than proper homesteads? That's not wisdom, Sam. That's poverty pretending to be clever. I'm telling you what I felt with my own hands. I pressed my palm against every shared wall in that structure and felt warmth radiating through. 51 degrees inside with fires so small they'd barely heat a cookpot. Their woodpile barely touched while mine disappears. My children sleep in coats. Their children sleep in regular clothes." The first visitor after Thornton was a Norwegian immigrant named Haugen, whose family had burned through their entire woodpile by mid-January. He arrived on January 22nd, desperate for any solution that might save them from freezing before spring. Haugen spent 3 hours examining the connected structure, walking through all 4 cabins, feeling the shared walls, standing in the protected courtyard, watching the families coordinate their fire schedule. He asked questions about wall construction, courtyard dimensions, and how the rotating duty worked without conflict. "We agreed before building," Alexander explained. "Each family takes the same shift every night. No confusion, no arguments. The Lindqvists know they burn until 9. The Brenners know they take over at 9. Routine makes cooperation simple." By the end of January, Alexander had hosted 16 visitors. Each came skeptical. Each left quiet with understanding. A county surveyor named Morrison brought measuring instruments and documented every dimension. The 48-foot square, the 16-foot courtyard, the 8 exterior walls serving 4 families instead of 16 walls serving 4. Samuel Thornton was first to ask about building connected structures. "I can't tear down my cabin and start over," he said, arriving in late February as the worst cold finally broke. "But my brother is filing a claim adjacent to mine come spring. Show me how 2 families could share a wall. Show me how to build connected instead of alone." Alexander studied Thornton's rough sketches. 2 cabins sharing 1 wall is simpler than 4. Build the shared wall thick and chink it well on both sides. Position your fireplaces on opposite exterior walls so heat flows through the shared wall between you. Agree on fire schedules. Watch for each other. He looked up at the man who had called their compound a poorhouse. "In Poland, we say that a wall between neighbors can be a barrier or a bridge. Your brother can be someone you see across empty prairie, or someone whose warmth passes through your wall while you sleep. Build the bridge. Let the wall carry heat instead of blocking it." Alexander Nowak lived another 28 years on that homestead in McPherson County. He died in the autumn of 1921, surrounded by children and grandchildren who had grown up knowing that warmth came not just from fire, but from neighbors whose walls touched your own. The original connected structure he built in 1893 was still functioning when he passed. 4 cabins still sharing walls, still rotating fire duty on cold nights, still housing families who understood that survival meant cooperation, not isolation. The compound remained occupied until 1954, when the last of the original family's descendants moved to Sioux Falls for work. The structure stood empty for a decade before a prairie fire claimed it in 1965. But by then, 3 generations had lived warm through Dakota winters that killed isolated homesteaders. And the principle had spread far beyond McPherson County. The winter of 1894 remained the benchmark against which all subsequent Dakota winters were measured. Old-timers would ask each other, "Is it as bad as '94?" And the answer was almost never yes. But even mild winters still sent isolated families shivering in cabins that stood alone, burning through wood piles while heat fled through 4 exposed walls. Every frozen morning reminded those who had visited the immigrant compound of the warmth they could have shared. By 1902, 14 homesteads in the region had incorporated some variation of connected construction. Not all were 4-family squares like Alexander's design. Samuel Thornton and his brother built twin cabins sharing a single wall, cutting their combined heat loss by nearly a quarter. 3 Swedish families built a row of connected homes, each sharing 2 walls with neighbors. A German settlement 20 miles north constructed a 6-family hexagon around a central courtyard, adapting the principle to their larger community. Each modification reflected local circumstances and family relationships, but the core principle never changed. Shared walls lost no heat. Connected families could rotate fire duty. Protected courtyards blocked wind that would steal warmth from exposed surfaces. The mathematics always favored cooperation over isolation. The principle Alexander understood, that connected dwellings dramatically reduce heat loss through shared walls, appears today in every townhouse, row house, and apartment building worldwide. Contemporary versions use modern insulation and central heating. But the core insight remains unchanged. A wall between heated spaces loses nothing. Only exterior surfaces bleed warmth to the cold. Build together, and the mathematics of survival shift in your favor. What Alexander knew, what his father and grandfather knew in villages outside Krakow, was that isolation was expensive, and connection was efficient. Americans treated separate cabins as proof of independence, each family proudly alone on their own claim. Europeans treated connected dwellings as proof of wisdom, each family sensibly sharing walls that would otherwise bleed heat into empty sky. The American way worked when fuel was limitless and pride mattered more than survival. The European way worked when winter tried to kill you and cooperation was the only mathematics that added up. Marta Nowak outlived Alexander by 7 years. She spent her final winters in the cabin they had built together, feeling warmth radiate through shared walls from neighbors whose grandparents had helped lay the foundation stones. After she passed, her daughter found a note tucked into the family Bible, written in Marta's careful Polish script. "He said we should share walls. The Americans said we were building a poorhouse, too poor to afford separate homes. We shared walls for 28 winters. The Americans burned their wood piles to ash and still shivered alone while we slept warm together." He remembered what Poland taught him. A wall can divide or a wall can connect. Divide, and each family fights winter alone. Connect and heat flows between neighbors like water finding its level. Our walls carried warmth from family to family. Their walls carried warmth into empty sky. We built a bridge. They built barriers. Our children slept warm because the Lindqvist's fire touched our wall. The Lindqvist's children slept warm because our fire touched theirs. This was not poverty. This was wisdom. This was how villages survived for centuries while proud men froze alone in houses that stood apart.